welcome to Simcast, a podcast brought to you by the Society for Imaging, Informatics, and Medicine. Greetings, Simcasters. The annual RSNA Conference has always been one of my favorite events to attend, offering a rich array of courses, lectures, and meeting events related to both the clinical imaging and informatics worlds. In this episode, hosts Mohammed, Prasanth, and our newest member, Ali, join with former guest and friend of the show, Herman Oosterich, to discuss the most recent 2021 meeting. They'll discuss hot topics such as clinical integration, cybersecurity. There's also discussion on new solutions to old and long-standing problems, looking at data analytics, AI, and of course, future directions, both in the imaging world and in our sister modalities of digital pathology. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the discussion.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're excited to have Herman Oosterich here with us to talk about RSNA. And, RSNA, oh my gosh, it's just so good to be back. It was great to see everyone. It was great to see all the exciting things. And I think there was just an energy that it wasn't missing, but it was just subtle in the year prior when we didn't have RSNA. So excited to talk about what happened, what maybe could happen next year, and what we're excited about. But Herman, any general thoughts? Let's get started with that.
Yeah, I share your excitement. To be honest, there's so many things you miss when you have a virtual meeting. When you're just walking around and you suddenly your eye catches something like, oh, that is super cool. What's going on here? Or that is new. And I really felt that I almost had this gap of a year that I picked up something in the virtual meeting. But there's really, of course, in addition to the networking, because part of the things you learn is by talking with peers and finding what's going on. So overall, I loved it. I actually liked the small scale, because it's much easier. So we say, well, we'll meet each other at 10 o'clock. You don't have to put another 10-minute buffer because you have to go from one building to the other building and you find out that you're in the wrong Starbucks and whatever it is. So it was overall very good. And, the thing is, when I talk with vendors, some of the vendors, they'd say that they had the best RSNA ever. Can you imagine that? I think so, even although the smaller scale and the less people, they still had the best RSNA ever. And for me, it was actually definitely one of the better ones. So overall, yeah, very, very positive.
For sure. And, actually, this was my first RSNA, to be honest with you.
Okay.
I didn't have the experience of having 65,000 attendees, but it was definitely the largest session I've been to, and not to mention the largest vendor exhibit that I've seen. And also just seeing all the kind of cutting edge, kind of up and coming, especially with the AI hall. Specifically, seeing what the startups are doing and what some of the bigger vendors are doing too. It was good to kind of leave the silo and see what else is going on.
For what it's worth, it was actually my first in-person RSNA as well, which a lot of people may find difficult to believe because I've been in imaging informatics for over a decade. I've been involved with RSNA indirectly many times in the past, but I've never actually been able to make the trek until this year. And I thought it was amazing. It's a very interesting experience for sure. Of course, attendance this year in person was, I think, 40% of what they normally get. So it's a lot smaller. I can't really draw any comparisons, but I thought it was a really good meeting too, very informative.
So did anything stand out to the three of you guys in particular, particularly around the imaging informatics content, AI, workflow, whatever, or any new announcements by the vendors that caught your eye?
Yeah, so Prasanth, particularly, it's like you mentioned AI, because there was definitely the dominant, message. You couldn't go to a booth that people wouldn't talk about AI. And the nice thing is, 2 years ago, the AI was kind of hidden in the basement, or really maybe not in the basement, but kind of at a different level. So it was not as accessible. So this time with the learning labs, it was very accessible, good opportunities. So definitely, no question, AI, that was really prominent. There was some new modalities, not that much. I think the phone counting, CT was definitely revolutionary. But what actually I thought was more interesting of the things that was not present. 2 years ago, it was all about point of care ultrasound. Some of these, POC ultrasound vendors were not even there. So it was actually even more interesting of the vendors and the things I did not see, because I would have expected to be more presence. But just from imaging informatics, some workflow companies, but AI was definitely the dominant, signal. Everybody talked about it. So.
Yeah. And, with the topic of AI, I think we're starting to see, I think we've heard this too, is that there's this hype, right, for the last few years, but now as the hype's kind of calming down, it's more on like a practical standpoint. Like, can we get AI in the clinic, right? Is it good for patients? What are the biases? A lot of sessions on the ethics of AI and just the pitfalls and trying to understand this black box and what it means for patients. I think that's what really stood out to me. And the other thing was, how do we start defining success in terms of clinical KPIs, clinical key performance indicators? I saw more of that this year, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that. Absolutely.
On my end, I'll say I've definitely noticed a number of things standing out, both in terms of things kind of like being hyping up and things kind of hyping down. So, I've noticed a number of vendors who used to hype up a lot about things like cloud are no longer going out of their way to use words like cloud, even though a lot of their solutions are now actually cloud-based. And of course, whether it's cloud native or not, it remains debatable, but it's good to see that this is kind of becoming a normal thing. And same thing with AI, it feels like it's a lot more real. It's not maybe 100% there, but it's a lot more real than just, a lot of talk. Also, another thing I found very interesting was the fact that you're also starting to see AI beyond just image interpretation. So you're starting to see AI in other fields like scheduling and follow-up management and things like that. So I wanted to ask the group here if they noticed any trends in general, between sessions that were had at RSNA or different vendor exhibits. What are your thoughts like? And start with Herman, maybe.
Well, AI, I didn't attend that many sessions, so my observation was mostly from the vendor side, from the floor. But I thought, when we talk about hype, I still don't think we're on the top of the hype curve. I think it's still a little bit overhyped. And so we have all these vendors that have these great algorithms, but how do we integrate them? Some people say it has to be part of the modality. Some people say it's a part of the packs. Some people say it has to be in the cloud. Some people say, no, we put it in a router. There is no really good location. And maybe it has to be all of those. But where does AI reside? That's really a challenge. And then depending on where it resides, how do we get the information in to the AI? And how do we get the information out of the AI? And what is the format? For example, if the AI algorithm says, well, this has to be on the top priority because it looks like this patient might have an indication of a stroke, how do we signal that back to a PACS work list so that it bumps to the top of the list? Or, sometimes the AI might say, well, this is the tube placement and the patient in the ICU is incorrect. We need to fix that right away. How do we notify that? And how do we identify? Is it the presentation state? Is it annotation? Is it the structured report? Is it the encapsulated PDF? Is it the secondary capture? And I've heard all of these different options, but I would think makes it probably very confusing for the system integrators, but also to the clinicians, because how do we see this result? So I think we're still not on the top of the hype curve yet. There's a lot of algorithms, a lot of algorithm developments. There's still a lot of things that we can explore. I think we just have the tip of the iceberg. And with regard to the integration and how we put it all together, we still have a lot to do. So I think next year, we'll talk about what we see next year, but it's still in works in progress from my perspective.
Herman, it's funny that you mentioned, like, where does the AI reside in the workflow process? We just had a recording with Matt Hayes. Technically, it was about non-image material impacts, right? And, we got on this topic and, what happens if the AI finds something and then, notifies somebody or sends out the HL7 message to the EHR before the radiologist has had a chance to look at it or, determine that, yes, this is a real finding or not. And, what do you do with that? Because the algorithm, right, is going to have this output, and the output in theory will be an HL7 message, maybe not, I don't know, but for argument's sake, let's say it is. And of course, the EHR is listening for these HL7 messages. So, how do you filter that so that it stays contained until we're ready to send it, or, verified or this, or, however, it opens up a lot of different possibilities for errors, either from workflow or false positive, false negative, things like that. So I think you're right that we're really going to have to drill down into this. Where does it live? How does it get into the workflow? How is that going to affect what people do or not do? And, are we looking at AI detection, AI diagnosis, like CAD-E versus CAD-X, if you will. Those are two very different things. So there's still a lot to kind of sort out. Ali, you have some thoughts on the trends as well?
Absolutely. And I was just, I love it when everything starts to connect, because some of the trends that I saw were from another episode that we had with the ACR DSI, we were talking about just the non-interpretive use cases. And I was pleasantly surprised, all good things, pleasantly surprised to see more and more, not just exhibits, sessions on non-interpretive use cases, how we're using natural language processing, moving on to transformer models, talking about addressing issues like automated protocoling, schedule forecasting for workload on the clinical side, improving resolution from low-dose scans. I think just seeing that wide breadth and seeing that more and more teams are focusing on those issues was really encouraging. I'm excited to see more of that next year and honestly to see how far we progress in a short time span of just 1 year. What did y'all think about how these silos are operating together? Are we ready for that seamless clinical integration? Is interoperability at that level, or do we still have some challenges we need to think about?
Yeah, I think just the challenges deal with interoperability. There's no really good standard. I mean, actually, maybe we have to say there are too many standards. There's 807, there's DICOM, there's IHE, there is, what in 807, what kind of transaction do we use for DICOM? Do we use structured report? Do we use presentation state? Do we use annotations, secondary capture, encapsulate the PDF, and go on and on and on? So I think, there are standards, but you haven't really filtered. No particular standard kind of bubbled up and say, this is how we're going to export the AI result, and the format that everybody can understand it and everybody is ready. It's almost, you see that with many new innovations. Something comes out and then the receiving side, which is the packs and the routers and the interpretations and the voice recognition systems, they have to be ready as well. And they usually lag behind, right? So again, if you have an AI finding, it would be great if that be automatically imported or into your voice recognition system. Well, are those voice speech recognition systems ready? So we definitely have some challenges with regard to integration. Now, IHE, integrating the healthcare enterprise, IHE, some guidance, but typically what happens is there's a standard being set out and then people say, well, that was a great idea, or people say, well, maybe not a great idea, we need to make some modifications. So there are some standards out there that people are starting to follow, but very slowly. And I think it will take a while. Just as an analogy, when the DBT, the digital breast tomosynthesis, systems came out, how many years did it take for the workstations to interpret these multi-slices breast imaging? Many, many, many years. And the modalities were already right there for a while. And I think the same thing, it's going to be pushed by these AI vendors. We have all these results, and it will take a while for the intake to really take place correctly. So.
Yeah, thank you, Herman. Now, at the risk of creating a shameless plug here, so I was heavily involved in a demo at RSNA called the Imaging AI in Practice. And of course, Ali has been very heavily involved in that one too. That demo is trying to push the envelope with adopting standards. So there were 2 new profiles that came from IHE last year on AI workflow and imaging and AI results distribution and management. Obviously, these profiles, you're kind of taking a shot in the dark, and it's a chicken egg problem. Do the vendors implement these profiles first, or do the hospitals and healthcare systems request these in their RFPs? But hopefully with demos like the Imaging AI in Practice, we're pushing the envelope so that people are actually more inclined to use these standards, and then these standards emerge as the de facto way of doing things, hopefully, but of course, only time will tell.
Recently, within the last week or so, we had this huge hit with Java with the log4j issue. So clearly a lot of people saw, cybersecurity is kind of more towards the forefront of their mind and dealing with these things. And, in the news, there've been several different healthcare institutions that have been hacked. So was there much about cybersecurity at RSNA or not? Is this kind of coming up more towards the forefront? Obviously being shadowed by AI.
I thought that cybersecurity was the big elephant in the room. Everybody knew about it, but it's hard. I guess if a provider is not going to go to us, they say, whoa, let me tell you what happened. Last month, we were hit by this ransomware attack. We were down for 3 weeks. People are not advocating that kind of issues. But I know there's this recent incident, but even in September, a couple of months ago, there was this big to-do, the Wall Street Journal article about a child that eventually died, and the mother, newborn child that died after 9 months old, she had brain damage, and the mother would argue in the lawsuit that it was because the hospital was hit by the ransomware attack, and that what actually caused the network to be down. So critical measurements about the woman in labor would not be notified. So this baby died for that. So there's a lot of things that were happening with regard to cybersecurity. So first of all, I thought it was the elephant in the room. There was not a lot of talk about it. There was one also communication. Another thing that is really critically important, I think you cannot really blame for an institution to be hit by a ransomware attack. What you can blame an institution for is to not be ready and not be prepared. This is not something that just happened the first time. It happened many years ago in the UK. We had this big, ransomware attack. If you're not ready, I think you should be shamed as of today, right? And so one of the things that you couldn't be ready for, there are some big vendors that are in the data storage arena that provide a cyber copy in the cloud that is always about a day behind of your software. So if you are hit by a ransomware attack, that would potentially could be able to restore your infrastructure within days instead of weeks, or sometimes I was one institution that I talked to that said that it took me 3 months before everything was in order after we were hit by the cyber attack. So I think really there's a lot of work to be done. And I really think when I talk about RSNA 22, and I really think it should be on the forefront, because I know that everybody should be worried about it. And instead of saying, well, this is for the IT guys, at HIMSS they can talk about, no, I think it should be really a topic that should be at the forefront, of the imaging people. They need to be aware that you have to be prepared. And if you're prepared, so you can limit the potential risk and eventually the patient safety concerns.
So I wanted to ask, if we can shift the topic just a little bit away from cybersecurity, if any of you have seen interesting workflow solutions that caught your eye at RSNA. And maybe, Ali, we start with you this time.
For sure. I think there are many interesting solutions, but the ones that really caught my eye, without naming vendors, were the ones that looked at some of the more non-interpretive use cases. So, for example, and we talked about this, looking at schedule forecasting, just being able to predict future workload, lining it up with anticipated schedules, and then also in real time, looking at the ER cases, stat cases, being able to pull in automatically, again, available radiologists based on their training, their speed, etc. I think that has such a strong potential to really change clinical workflow. And I can't think of the number of times that we could have benefited from that in actual practice. So I'm excited to see feedback from users who started using the solution this year. And then also going back to RSNA 22 to see if there are any updates or any new additions to existing software.
When I talk with clinical colleagues and they say, what's your number one problem with PACS and viewing? And they always say workflow number one. It's always on the top, if not on the top three. So it's definitely a major issue. Another thing, when I talk with fellow consultants, from what they see in these providers in the institution, they say, we've seen some institutions that are so inefficient and they could improve the workflow so much, but they sometimes don't know where to start and they don't know the capabilities. And just as simple, I saw in a presentation or a talk, I think or publication a few months ago, like the amount of clicks that a radiologist does to look at a study ranges from, I think, like 7 or so to 30, depending on the radiologist. They say, why is that person that does 30 clicks should be able to do it more efficient, right? So after I say that, there could be a lot of improvements made. I also find that some of the PACS vendors are not necessarily in the best position to improve the workflow. I see there's sometimes issues with prefetching timely, the right priors based on the right study description and body parts and at the right time and all that stuff. So almost every institution I go look at, they have additional middleware, routers, intelligent middleware software that grab these images exactly at the right time and the right place, and then also put it together with the AI results and put it to the right things. Or sometimes they hold up information. Like earlier, we had a discussion about, do we want to have an AI result go to the EMR if the radiologist didn't look for it? all of that intelligent routing, I mean, it's intelligent routing, but it's really there's orchestration. I remember there was an orchestrator in the demo of the AI. In the center, we have this orchestrator. An orchestrator gets the information at the right time to the right place, right? He fetches it and it distributes it. And it seems to be that this middleware, with several companies that provide that, it's almost a necessity. And if you apply that correctly, there's a lot of major improvements you could make in getting the right information at the right time to the right physician.
Yeah, thank you, Herman. I'll add my 2 cents here. I definitely saw some also very interesting solutions. People have been talking about point of care ultrasound, and at the show, without naming any vendors, this one might be obvious, but we've seen pretty much point of care MRI scanning, it's always exciting when you see innovation like this happening that is both beneficial in the developed world, but also can have great manifestation in the developing countries. So that was really nice. One other thing I'll also say is I saw some other cool solutions. One example are solutions for follow-up management. And you've seen prototypes in the past that were really good at recognizing follow-up recommendations or reports. But in my opinion, what was missing is always how do you close the gap of what happens after that? And this year, I saw some interesting solutions. Again, I'm not going to name anybody, but I thought they were like, wow, this is promising. Maybe this won't be a problem in the future. And I know we had a Simcast episode not too long ago where we interviewed Dr. Paul Naji. And I remember, I think this was like one of his, don't quote me, but I think it was like his biggest career regrets of like, why is this still a problem in radiology? So I think, Paul, let's keep an eye on these startups. I think hopefully this is going to be history soon. And the other thing I've also seen is a number of companies that are also bringing things like radiology and medicine to consumers, enabling patients to be more engaged and more in charge of their health, enabling things like access to their records and images and, no more CDs and things like that. So this is always nice to see. That being said, I did want to ask somebody here, did you see anything digital pathology related at SIM at all, or sorry, at RSNA?
Yeah, it's kind of on the peripheral. I mean, when you look at some of the monitor vendors, they had a beautiful, color monitors that said this is calibrated and this is optimized to show this the pathology. But some of the storage providers, they were kind of, I wouldn't say frustrated, but they were kind of like, why don't people not get it? You know what I mean? Because this the pathology is so prevalent in many other countries, like in Europe. I mean, I'm originally from the Netherlands, and when I visit back my relatives, I think 80% of the whole Netherlands is completely digital in pathology. I mean, there are hospitals that have done it for 6, 7, 8 years. They have all the, the slides digitized. It's readily available. I think I wouldn't say the frustration, but the question that people have is like, digital pathology right now, it's not going to be perfect. The radiology started maybe 20 years ago, but not being perfect. Why would it prevent you from diving in? You know what I mean? Why don't we get our feet wet? Why don't we start? Because there's so many obvious advantages, like be able to share this slide with other colleagues that are specializing in that particular kind of pathology, whether cytology or whatever it is, and providing these services to remote locations. I mean, if I would be living, or somebody would be living in Alaska and they would take a specimen, and the nearest pathologist is all the way in Anchorage or wherever, or even in Denver, Colorado, whatever it is. Or you get a specimen that the specialist in, Sloan Kettering or the Mayo Clinic or wherever, wants to look at. Having that advantage, it's almost like frustrating. It's almost like, why don't we dive in? Why doesn't and of course it's an investment because there's additional cost. You still need to make the slide. You still need to do the staining. There's additional cost because you need to get these slide scanners, but there's an existing infrastructure. Of course, you need to scale it up, but you have your radiology packs, buy another petabyte or so, whatever. I mean, it's not that expensive, and store that in your existing VNA. So most hospitals right now have a VNA enterprise, so they're more geared towards not only just storing radiology images. So it's more like let's do it, what keeps you back, and that's what I hear from a lot of vendors that are in this technology.
You bring up a really good point here, Herman, because I mean, sometimes kind of coming up from behind can actually be an opportunity for leapfrogging. So maybe pathology doesn't have to go through the growing pains that radiology experienced, doing all this digitization work. They might just be able to harvest some lessons learned. And while on that topic, also shameless plug for Simcast, we recently did an episode with a couple of members of the Digital Pathology Association that everybody is welcome to reference. And we're actually about to do another episode on digital pathology that is a lot more technically oriented, which I'm privy to the details. So I'm just going to say stay tuned because it's going to be very, very intriguing. And with that, I'll pass it to Ali for the next question.
It's all intriguing, Mahan. And I think going back to the idea of looking at these AI solutions, I know I hate to drag the conversation back there, but I think it's important we start thinking about how we're evaluating success and how we're measuring success. And I think when it comes to the idea of data analytics, I know we saw several platforms to help, some dashboards, different metrics that we're looking at, even the idea of having the soul codes that you mentioned at the Imaging AI in Practice demo booth. By the way, I think there needs to be more soul. I think that was one of the more eye-opening experiences that I personally had, and hoping to see more of that. But in terms of data analytics and identifying and standardizing clinical parameters, are we seeing that, or are we still a step before or a step ahead of that, maybe in the next few years?
One of the challenges, and I work with several companies that say, Herman, we'd like to do some analytics. We'd like to look at the DICOM header. And then guess what? The DICOM headers, the data is so, I would say, dirty, is so bad. Because in the past, if you have a CT vendor, they said, okay, as long as we can look at the image on the workstation, everything is good. But the source to table distance varies while the table height is the same. They don't necessarily worry about it, or whether, some of the information is encoded in private text. They don't worry about it. So if you really want to do data analytics, you can only do that if you have strong coding, and you cannot do it on dirty data. You need to have data that is correct. And till now, people really have more focused on, we need to display the image correctly, not necessarily all the metadata has to be correct. And so I think there needs to be almost like a revisiting of all of the data that is being sent and being shared, and all the metadata. Let's look at it again. Just as another example, if you want to measure turnaround time, so we want to know when the CT started, when did it end? Well, if you look at the DICOM header, there's a content time, there's an acquisition time, there's a series time, there's a study time, there's a whatever time. They're like, I don't know, making up 10 times or so. And then everybody uses another time. So if I would write a data analytics program, what time am I going to use, right? And that's different between the different vendors. This is a very simple thing. You just want to measure turnaround. I just want to say, how long does it take for my CT scan to start till my doctor finishes the report, for example? That's a good example of that. But if I cannot measure that correctly, or if my other scanner has a different time stamp, then I cannot compare that correctly, then we have a problem. So definitely people are trying to do more. And, it's all about big data. It's not only in medical, everybody wants to. It's all about big data, data analytics. But everybody is wrestling with the data not being as accurate. So coding will definitely help a lot. But we really encourage the vendors to go back. So listen, please clean up your data, right? And be conscious about that there are people that might want to use it to benefit, to create this big data to benefit practices and be more efficient and improve patient care.
I think that's a really important point. And I think, when it comes to data, at least on the clinical side, I feel like, and maybe I'm generalizing here, but it's hard to think about something that you're not seeing, something that's running in the background, unless you're intentionally having that conversation. So I'm just really happy that we can even start that conversation. And going back to your point about a lot of us are focused on actually displaying the image, displaying the results. I think what was optimistic for me, at least, was now we're starting to have a conversation about what DICOM SR and DICOM SCR. What are these different options? One's an overlay, one's more static, the other's more dynamic. You can interact with it. What that looks like, again, without naming any vendors, we saw some really neat ways to display these options and to actually juxtapose them to see what the differences are. So even getting that bit of education out there for the attendees, I think, was crucial. And hopefully we can expand on that. And again, use that to start moving on to this more downstream process. Absolutely. Mahan, is there anything else that you think we should be thinking about or talking about along these lines?
Not much that I can add to what you both said, other than the fact that, I agree. Analytics has been sorely lacking proper interoperability standards to do this here. You have some solutions on the market which are vendor neutral, but I feel like we need a lot more vendor neutrality here. And even those vendor neutral solutions could benefit from some kind of global standard / profile that everybody follows. So things are more plug and play. And I'll just stop at that. I don't want to be taking stabs at anybody. Now, I do want to move the conversation forward here. So the question I have for you, gentlemen, is, did you see anything that was interesting, noteworthy from a modality point of view? And if you did, how do you think these are going to plug into the workflow? Herman, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'm kind of a CT geek, because I used to spend some time with a vendor on writing some of the software for the early CT scanner. So to see this CT, photon counting CT, that's revolutionary. And so really, what is a photon counting CT? Basically, we take, the pixel, and the pixel now, instead of having just information about attenuation, so to speak, we really have spectral information by photon counting. So what's the impact? Well, having spectral information, that means we can eliminate some of the noise. So if we eliminate some of the noise, that means, right, we can potentially either have less dose, or with the same dose, we have a higher resolution. We can better differentiate between, for example, what is contrast and what is bone, right? So we could even, I was seeing another article that says, well, if you have a standard CT that has with and without contrast, maybe we don't need to without contrast anymore. So can you imagine? So you have half of the dose exposure and the time that it takes, because you only need to do the for contrast, because we can differentiate so well what is the contrast. We might not necessarily need maybe even a dual energy CTs anymore. So I actually, kind of interesting, I spent probably a year of my career to think about beam hardening artifacts and doing things. Now, that's kind of a niche kind of a thing. But if you ever look at the CT scan for the hips and the skulls, and you see that there's all these white streaks, all of that is suddenly, you don't have that anymore, but it's this photon counting CT. So from my perspective, it's revolutionary. Well, maybe not, but very evolutionary. And I'm really glad to see that. So definitely, that's a major noteworthy, I would say, new development. The other thing is, it was a little bit noteworthy that some of the things that I did not see, people didn't talk about VNAs. That was kind of interesting. That seemed to be okay, but you see that the VNA, what actually was originally the vendor neutral archive, was actually developed, or the idea became about the VNA to not having to do the migration. Now it's all about enterprise. We want to have an enterprise archive that really, there's all the different ologies. So the shift from VNA to an enterprise archiving solution, that was obvious. But then again, so I didn't see a lot of point of care ultrasounds. That's kind of interesting. Maybe we're a little bit over the hype curve there, that when people find out, well, it's nice to give all the physicians now an ultrasound probe instead of a stethoscope. But what happens if one of the physicians said, this is an interesting image, I like to store it in my archive? Well, that was kind of a problem. Because what is the patient that it belongs to? And do we have an account to define? Do we have a visit that we need to tag it onto? And how do I get it back into the EMR? Getting all these point of care devices, and everybody's going to take pictures, not only with the POC ultrasound, but this smartphone. After the initial excitement, I think we're a little bit going down in the trough of the disillusionment for the Gartner curve. Like, okay, we need to really figure out how to do this and how to deal with these point of care things. Yeah, that was my perspective a little bit. Kind of interesting to see what Ali's perspective is from a clinical perspective. And I'm always get excited about new technologies. But what's a new clinical application that you've seen?
No, absolutely. I was going to say that was very thorough. I'm learning. I just love listening to you talk, because I feel like I'm learning so much too. But one thing I wanted to note was just being able to see some of these point of care modalities, right? So we've seen point of care ultrasound, but now seeing point of care MRI, right? Just portable devices that we can take at the bedside, and actually seeing this progress from what was an idea to practical implementation and having adjustments at each stage. Seeing, okay, we've worked on the design of the device, maybe working on the accessibility, right? But also now when we get the images, we're acquiring the images. Where is it going? How's it getting there? How are we improving on some of the limitations of maybe having like a low strength magnet? Being able to use AI there, I think it's a beautiful symphony of all these tools coming together. I think that's wonderful. And from the clinical standpoint, just being able to bring these types of devices to a larger audience, right? From a global health perspective is going to be exciting to see how we can do that, when we do that. I think integration is always, again, looking at those imaging AI in practice demos. We've talked about it a couple of times, and I think that just shows how important interoperability integration really is going to be to see anything really come out of all these different tools. So I think before we can even talk about clinical impact, we really have to talk more about interoperability. And I think that's something, again, that doesn't come intuitively unless you have an intentional conversation about it. But those are my main points, honestly. I think we've talked about quite a bit here. And well, is there anything else that both of y'all, and maybe I have some thoughts here too, but is there anything else worth mentioning from RSNA 2021, just briefly with the remaining time that we have?
I can go. So I think the elephant in the room, of course, is COVID. And it's nice to see that, they had about 19,000 people gather, and it was a nice, safe event. And, of course, just to put everybody kind of in the context, not only is it COVID, but I remember the day I arrived to attend RSNA, the news had just broken out about the new variant, Omicron. So, of course, that kind of cast a shadow on the meeting. But yeah, kudos to the RSNA organizers for organizing a nice and safe event this year.
Was there anything else?
Yeah, no, I'd like to chime in. It was my second biggest meeting after HIMSS, but I was kind of pleasantly surprised with how well we could do a meeting despite of the COVID, despite of a pandemic going on, how we can still do a safe meeting and still gain so much. And like I said earlier, some of the vendors said it was the best RSNA ever because the people that attended really, really, really wanted to be there because they had to go for the hoop here. You had to do the testing and the whatever. But so I think, it was overall one of the probably the best RSNAs. It was not too cold, no snow. We could get back in and out, but this sometimes happens as well. And overall, it was very good. Yeah.
And I got to say, being able to access the talks, at least from the educational side, is a big positive. I think that's come out of a lot of the conferences that we're seeing in this pandemic era. I was able to catch some of the diverse talks in person, fortunately, walked around to the posters and some of the educational exhibits, but being able to come home and there was some I missed for sure, given how big McCormick Place is. I was a bit naive in that. I thought I could sprint from one end to the other, trying to make it to every talk on time. But now being able to come home and watch those talks that I missed, I think is just a really nice resource. And I think something that we hopefully see going forward as a standard versus maybe a temporary fix just while travel and restrictions kind of get back to norms over the next months to year.
Yeah, Ali, I like you mentioned the educational exhibits. That's really invaluable because you walk there and you see something, and that's interesting, and there will be sitting somebody there, and they're so passionate about their exhibit and talking about the research and what they accomplished. And that's something that's really hard to do virtually because you could browse for it virtually, and if you don't see a person that tells you about things. I really learned a lot. Just another anecdote. There was an exhibit from a hospital in Denmark, I think, Scandinavia, I think was Denmark. And that the AI algorithm, because they would detect whether the markers were incorrectly or not. They looked at an extremity, like the right leg, and they said, okay, it says L, but it's not L, it's really the right leg. Little things like that. So very anecdotal, kind of really interesting way of running an AI algorithm on a body part that would potentially prevent the incorrect body part from being interpreted. Small things that we really don't think about when we think about AI. Sometimes AI is very subtle and very helpful and can make major changes, make major differences in things. It's not always excitement of cancer detection, just identifying the right body part. That was really amazing to me.
For sure. And even seeing some of the algorithm, I can't remember where I saw this one, but seeing the algorithm that was focusing more on image quality, right? Looking at positioning, looking at the side of things before it comes to the PACS, comes to the radiologist, just really innovative. And I think it's so important to see these and get the mind stimulated and to maybe use that information to start other projects that you maybe hadn't thought of before going to RSNA. So absolutely know what you mean.
And that leads me to the next question of what is it that you'd like to see at RSNA 22? Ali, let's start with you.
Oh my gosh, this is a kid in the candy shop kind of question. If I could have anything more, I think more of the interactive sessions. I love those. We had the deep learning labs, just being able to sit down with an expert, content expert, and actually working through problems in real time, gaining those skills more interactive sessions would be excellent. I think that from the demos side and from the exhibit side, I think just building on what we saw this year, seeing more use cases, seeing more non-interpretive use cases addressed through solutions, seeing how they work together, maybe through the imaging AI and practice demos, if those are back next year, would be kind of the perfect way to follow up on what I thought was an excellent RSNA 2021 meeting. Herman, what about you?
Yeah, I really think when you talk with a vendor, let's say go to the vendor and say, tell me a little bit about the technology behind this, what you're doing. And then he said, well, I'm the salesperson. Let me talk to the product guy. And the product guy knows a little bit about it as well. But then they go to the learning lab and he's the developer. And it says, okay, can you show me what's in the structured report? It's a completely different level of communication and information gathering that you get from a learning lab, because you talk with the people that, the brains behind these algorithms and the implementers. So from my perspective, and I think for a lot of perspective, you want to know really what's behind the screen, how this all magically happens. I learned more in the learning labs than anywhere else. And also the educational exhibit. So from my perspective as a technologist, technology person, very, very useful. And I think also for clinical people, I think for a clinician, it's good to know what is behind the screens, what's the technology. And I talk with an algorithm developer what his challenges are. So I really think definitely I hope to see more of that.
One thing I just remembered while you're talking about that was I'd love to see more emphasis on when AI failed. What does it look like when AI solutions don't work? And I think once we can start looking at that, we can start talking about why it did that. It's so key to be critical. I know it can be tough sometimes, but I'd like to see more examples of that and more of attacking that black box and actually seeing what's, again, like I said, behind the curtain. And Herman, is there anything else?
It's kind of the triggers you said when AI fails, but it's really about the context, because AI could be successful detecting something. But as a clinician, you could say, well, but I just did the biopsy and I know that this was not cancerous, right? Because they have the context, because they have the lab result and they have maybe the prior exam. So I think more contextual information will be really, really valuable. And then you can put this, what you call failure, in a perspective. So yeah, that's my last 2 cents.
Absolutely. And thank you again both for your time. This has been an enlightening talk, and I think it's kindled some nostalgia for the meeting for sure. I kind of miss being there, and I'm hoping that we can all meet up there with others next year. With that, I hope the conversation does continue offline, both for our audience and for ourselves. And with that, we'll come to a close. So thank you, and please join us for the next episode of Simcast.
Simcast has been brought to you by the Society of Imaging Informatics in Medicine. Please visit our website at siim.org for more information and educational content, including webinars and an archive of prior episodes. Please follow us on Twitter at sim_tweets. Thank you to our listeners for your continued support.